Welcome everyone, Tashidele. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you here at this venue. We are honored to have the Rinpoche join us. I will not do the formal introductions of the panel that Professor Dibyesh will be doing afterwards. I simply want to introduce you to CSD, to Center for the Study of Democracy, which is hosting this event in collaboration with Tibet Watch. So the Center for the Study of Democracy was founded in 1989. It's based in the School of Social Sciences at this university. This center undertakes research across a range of critical, social, and political challenges, promoting an interdisciplinary environment. We have various themes on post-colonial politics, nationalism, small states, Asian geopolitics, and there is an explicit focus on engagement with local and global communities and impacting upon public debates around the subjects of rights, identities, and justice, which is ever more important in the contemporary world. This event, today's event, which is titled Tibetan Buddhism, China and the Dalai Lama, Tibet and Contested Geopolitics, we will be recording this event, is organized in collaboration with Tibet Watch, and Joe Hipgrave from Tibet Watch will give the closing vote of thanks, and he will tell you more about Tibet Watch. But I would like to mention that Tibet Watch is a UK-registered charity that works to promote the human rights of Tibetan people through monitoring, research, and advocacy. It is an indispensable source of reliable information and expert analysis from Tibet and is relied upon by Tibet and China watchers worldwide and also by policymakers worldwide. So this conversation today will deal with a topic that's very significant in Asian geopolitics and delve into the complexities of it. It references and indexes the present and future of China-Tibet relations and challenges the perceived divides between religion and politics, bringing together experts to discuss how the dynamics involved and the politics that is being played by Communist Party-ruled China over the religious institution of reincarnation in Tibet, Buddhism in general, and the future of the global icon, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in particular. So it goes beyond simply the China-Tibet relations. My name is Nitasha, Professor Nitasha Kaul. I'm a professor of politics, international relations, and critical interdisciplinary studies, and also, as you might have guessed, the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. I'm also a member of the board of Tibet Watch, and I hope you have a brilliant evening today, and I look forward to this discussion, after which we shall have refreshments at the back, and we hope that many fruitful, valuable, important conversations germinate here and can be taken forward. Thank you very much, and welcome.
Thank you, Nitasha. Thank you, Professor Kaul, for the introduction. So my role, I'm Dibyesh Anand. I'm the Professor of International Relations, and I'll be chairing this. We have got 3 speakers and a half. I'm including myself as a half a speaker because I'm not the speaker, I'm the chair, but this is an area I've worked on, and some of you know for more than 2 decades now. So the first speaker for us will be Telo Tulku Rinpoche, not in the order because we'll go the other way around, but Telo Tulku Rinpoche is the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Russia, Mongolia, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Can it get bigger? I guess, but it's a lot, right? Including Russia, you can imagine how tricky that would be. But anyway, he was based at the Tibet Culture Information Center, Office of Tibet in Moscow, Russia until 2023, when he became the first religious leader in the country who publicly condemned Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. You don't need to guess what would happen after that. And if the fact that he's here, that means that at the moment, he can't go back to Russia. That's how it is. I'm not going to read out the entire bio because when you registered, you would have seen the bio and you can read it because I want us to focus on the topic here. So welcome Telo Tulku Rinpoche because we organize this around you. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
In fact, I was saying that I have met him a decade ago for the first time. That was in Mongolia for IATS conference, and subsequently since then in Dharamshala, Belgium, and other places. So anyway, Tenzin Choekyi, she's a senior researcher at Tibet Watch. She provides analysis of the situation inside Tibet to parliamentarians, journalists, and campaigners. Again, she's multi-versed. She has done a lot of work in camping around Tibet and also creating and challenging knowledge production on Tibet. I'm not going to the details here. And Kate Saunders is a writer, author who has specialized in Tibet for more than 20 years. And again, we have known each other possibly starting in this room in 2008 when we had certain events. And some of you know what happened in 2008 was the large-scale protests in Tibet, the mass protests. I know Kate since then. But not only that, she has worked immensely with various organizations around the world in terms of advocacy for Tibet. That's how I put it. That's my interpretation of how you work. But she's a researcher, she's a journalist, she has written a lot, she has written different reports. Again, you'll get to hear all three of them. That's the introduction part. I think I'm speaking too fast, but that's okay. That's my style.
That's okay.
So we'll start with Kate, and I've asked each one of them to speak for 7 minutes. That's the first round. Then I'll have 1 or 2 questions for them, specific. Then another round, and then we'll have a lot of time for audience question and answer. But as you can imagine, this is a subject that's not only an academic subject, whatever that academic subject might imply, that it has significance for politics, for geopolitics, but also lived realities of many. This is a subject in 2008, and the context I'll give you, 2008 and 2009, Foreign Office, remember asking me questions around the Dalai Lama and reincarnation. So I organized a major conference here involving various Tibetan academics and leaders, including all those who ended up becoming, or most of them ended up becoming also Sikyongs in the future, right? This before Sikyong leader appeared in 2008 and 2009. But no one wanted to talk about it. So everyone would mention, but no one wanted to talk publicly about it. But by now we're in a period where it is Chinese government that has made sure that if you don't talk about this subject, an important subject, they may control and they may hijack the entire issue. That's what we are witnessing. So it's a very timely political issue. It is about survival of Tibetans, right? On that note, I'll pass on to Kate first, and then Tenzin, and then Rinpoche. Please, Kate.
Thanks. Is this on?
Yes, it should be.
Is that on? Yes. Okay. So it really should be Rinpoche speaking first as our star guest, but he's asked me to go first. So I'm going to try to summarize the broad sweep context of this event and discussion in under 7 minutes. So the issue of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation and his worldwide influence are far from being esoteric and irrelevant to our very pressing 21st century concerns. They've become actually a new front in a high-stakes political and civilizational struggle which has international dimensions. So as the Dalai Lama ages and China seeks to achieve global supremacy, political, economic, energy dominance, we face a new era of geopolitical competition. And Tibet has been viewed by most Western governments and observers across the world primarily as an issue of religious freedom and human rights, and mostly its strategic significance has been overlooked. And that means that governments and neighboring countries can be less prepared to deal with China's cognitive warfare strategies, current threats, and future outcomes. So Tibet is of high importance to Beijing and Xi Jinping. It's the world's highest and largest plateau. It's encircled by mountains, with Xinjiang to the north bordering Pakistan. Before China invaded Tibet in 1950, there was no direct contiguous border between India and China. Now the PLA, of course, deploys long-range heavy rocket artillery on the plateau facing India, and it's constructing infrastructure rapidly across the border from Arunachal Pradesh. So China uses the same grey zone tactics in the Himalayas, which are effectively the northern rim of the Indo-Pacific, as it did in building artificial islands in the South China Sea. And the PRC has not only made incursions into the independent kingdom of Bhutan, but it's constructed an entire network of roads, buildings, and military outposts deep in a sacred valley. PRC has also encroached into Nepalese territory, and it's succeeded in almost closing the gateway into exile for Tibetan refugees and delegitimizing an entire Tibetan community in Nepal itself. So Tibet is the source of most of Asia's rivers. Its water is regarded as a strategic asset by the PRC, essential for addressing China's progressive scarcity. And the plateau is a global climate change epicenter, warming nearly 3 times as fast as the rest of the world. And yet even so, China is pursuing plans for multiple mega dams in the youngest, most seismically active mountain range in the world. Tibet's rich mineral resources, including lithium, which is increasingly important. Right.
Okay,
Sorry.
Can you ask how long it will take to put, and then we can just pause?
Yeah,
5 minutes, okay.
5 minutes.
Could you pause? Because I think it's because we also have to work hard, so we can ask them to wait 5 minutes. For
Yeah.
5 minutes, I'm loud. Can you hear me with that noise? So I'm just wondering what can I do in 5 minutes, because
Well,
I don't want you, or maybe you.
should I speak more loudly? Yeah.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'll use this one. Is that, hang on. Is that better? Doesn't sound as loud to me. Yeah. Okay. I'll try and speak a bit louder. Hopefully we can hear. No, it's on.
Yeah,
Red?
it's on.
Yeah, it's on. This one seems better, but anyway. So, for all of these reasons, China is anxious to maintain control over Tibet, and it describes the current period as the Dalai Lama ages as critical and complex. And it's developed systematic and elaborate plans over several decades to sinicize, which means to break and reshape Tibetan Buddhist beliefs and practices. That's backed by both dystopian high-tech and grassroots methods to ensure compliance to the PRC. As the Dalai Lama approaches 90, China's intensified a counter-influence operation critical to its control over Tibet, but also to project its dominance beyond its borders. And the PRC characterizes this campaign against the Dalai Lama as a matter of national security tied to China's core concerns. And Buddhism is used as a tool in Xi Jinping's main foreign policy vehicle to gain dominance, the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's seeking to gain discourse power in global Buddhism, countering India's influence, and also Dharamsala's, of course. And China is seeking to rearrange the entire security architecture across the Himalayas in its favor. And more recently, we've seen increased efforts to create a pro-China grouping, including leaders from countries with Buddhist heritage, including Mongolia and Pakistan, and excluding India. So Beijing aims to fragment and ultimately end all global support for Tibetans and Tibet in the future by installing a party state-approved Dalai Lama. And absurdly, China expresses outrage when the Dalai Lama suggests that he may not reincarnate at all. But the Dalai Lama is a progressive political pragmatist. His strategic ambiguity over his own reincarnation really succeeds in casting China in contrast as old-fashioned and out of touch by insisting upon his reincarnation using an arcane imperial ritual. So for centuries, Tibet's influence has extended beyond its borders, and that's primarily through its culture, its religion, and its philosophy. And religious sophistication is at the heart of Tibetan greatness. Mongol Khans, emperors in Peking have all sought to learn from its advanced civilization. So not only then, but also now, today, the Dalai Lama's influence and his leadership, a network of influence right across the Tibeto-Mongolian Buddhist world, is a central factor in balancing conflicting interests and preserving resilience in vulnerable communities. So this nexus of spiritual and secular authority is also an important counterpoint to authoritarian and despotic leadership. And in that regard, Tibetans identify with Ukrainians in their struggle to prevent the extinction of their linguistic and their cultural heritage, and to combat a heavily distorted historical narrative by China, which is designed to deceive and confuse Chinese citizens and the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Is it working?
Can you
Yeah.
be louder?
Okay.
So
Yeah? Okay. So when I looked at the topic, Tibetan Buddhism, China and Dalai Lama, Tibetan contested geopolitics, the first thing that came to my mind is the word Tibet, because of the recent strategy by China to completely make people think Tibet as something that is not what Tibetans think. So they are trying to replace Tibet with the word Xizang. And it's not a word, even the way it sounds is not Tibetan to start with. So that's really important to remember. Just like the way, when Twitter changed its name to X, and how the consequence was media would eventually start reporting this change by using that change, putting Twitter in brackets and then using X. But then here, when they replace Tibet, it is a country that has been colonized after the Second World War in the heart of Asia, and the significance of which we just have to use our common sense to look at the map and see that it is really in the heart of Asia, the water tower of Asia, the roof of the world, which is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the global average. The second thing is that since His Holiness the Dalai Lama came to exile in 1959, followed by waves of Tibetan refugees, he established a parallel universe of Tibet in exile, of freedom in exile, where monasteries were built, where schools were built, where men and women who themselves had endured so much suffering and traveled through paths that were so dangerous have looked after children who were orphans and built Tibetan children schools in exile. And this generation of Tibetans are now in all across the world. Now, when you think about how Tibetans remember the recent media coverage of Tibet, one of the most disturbing events for the Tibetans in last year was how media covered an incident of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's interaction with a young boy. I think everyone will be aware of that because everybody saw it on the television, but there was not a single Tibetan quoted in all those coverage at all. That was the media coverage of the Dalai Lama, not even mentioned that he is the spiritual leader of Tibet in exile. That's how ignorant media was and disrespectful in covering an issue that hurt Tibetans all across the world. Now, when we look at how that incident was used by the Chinese Communist Party, we know they were completely backfired, until His Holiness the Dalai Lama's photo is banned inside Tibet. His video, his audio recordings, people get imprisoned, people get detained, to the extent that on His Holiness the Dalai Lama's birthday, on every 6th of July, they use metaphors to wish him happy birthday. That's how Tibetans have never lost their faith. But still, despite of the countless imprisonment of Tibetans, the Chinese government used that video circulate worldwide and spread it in the media inside Tibet, thinking that they will lose their faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because the world has also covered His Holiness the Dalai Lama's incident without Tibetan perspective. But what we saw is Tibetans touching their smartphones on their head, even if they cannot prostrate at his feet in person. What they did was, for the first time, in the recent memory of Tibetans, families were gathered together around a phone, feeling safe for the first time, and then rejoicing that they can now see His Holiness the Dalai Lama without fear, together. So that's the strategy that the Chinese government is using, but it has until today backfired on them, that the Chinese Communist parties believe that there are no alternative views, that religion has to be eliminated, has to this day, 7 decades after the colonization of Tibet, has not changed. But still they have organized, they have used their human resources, they have enrolled so many people in their party hierarchies, and basically created a society where there is no prosperity. And and still to now control the lineages of the Tibetan Buddhism, since, of course, they have disappeared His Holiness the Panchen Lama. Of course, they have also killed, Tulku Rinpoche. They have imprisoned Pangri Rinpoche, who started orphanages. There are, of course, Rinpoches who have fled Tibet into exile. All of these are, speaks for themselves that Tibetan Buddhism or any religion under the governance of the Chinese Communist Party is not, possible to flourish. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama here in the world emphasizes oneness of humanity. He meets all the spiritual leaders of the world and then engages in dialogues with them, with the scientists, whereas in Tibet and in every occupied territories under the Chinese rule, what the Chinese Communist Party emphasizes is uniformity, that there cannot be diversity, and there should be ethnic unity. So you can see the difference between the vision of His Holiness Dalai Lama out here in the world, a farmer's son, as he starts in his biography, My Land and My People, even if he has come into exile at 26, and now he is 89 years old, but the Chinese Communist Party has not ever, never even succeeded to even, eliminate faith in Tibet. Generations of Tibetans who have not even seen His Holiness in person. But the strategy that the Chinese government used, since 2007, they put out these measures called Measures for the Management of Reincarnation of the Living Buddhas of the Tibetan Buddhism. Living Buddha itself is a word that is very much diluted, nothing that seems close to the Sanskrit original. Secondly, from 2000 and at the end of 2008 onwards, they started constructing in Lhasa, I think it was in Lhasa, Tibetan Buddhism Academy, where they are now grooming all the young incarnate lamas. All of them are being taught to worship the Communist Party. Nothing related to what Buddha has taught, which is, to see the reality as it is and to, end the cyclic existence of the samsara, the suffering, that the wheel of suffering that all of us are in. So that's 2007 measures, 2008 construction of the Tibetan Buddhism Academy, which was finally established in 2011. And then as a result of which now in Tibet, the title Tulku has gained a new social meaning because of the Chinese Communist Party's decision. It's like a title which you can trade, because under the Communist Party governance, there's so much corruption, and there's a saying that a taxi driver in Bodh Gaya, the land where Buddha attained enlightenment, he told me, if the leader is a thief, everybody else will be thief. So if the leader, if from above it's corrupted, Xi Jinping, who has now amended the constitution to stay in power for life, what kind of a system will be under his leadership, where everybody would also want to stay for some sort of power in all throughout their life, whether in one office or to go to the next. So amid all of these, changes that the Chinese Communist Party, makes through its endless regulations, measures, laws upon laws, which are never ever guaranteed for the Tibetans, whether it's language, mother tongue education, right to develop, use their own mother tongue. We have received news last year that in Kanze, which is in eastern Tibet, the primary, the higher secondary and the middle schools will be having their last Tibetan language classes. So, and you see that the media is trying to make propaganda about how there is Tibetan education in Tibet, but they don't even see that what Tibetans are calling for is Tibetan education where everything is expressed, written in their own languages. It's not just Tibetan language class that they are asking for. And much more still, under this system and laws of now private education or double reduction policy, Now you have a school system which has gotten worse over the years, let alone higher education system in Tibetan language, where in school there's Tibetan language teachers are really struggling. And then outside the Tibetan the education system, if you want to have private tuition, those are also illegal. And then you have the monasteries where enrolling children under 18 years old is illegal. So what option do you really have to, learn Tibetan? Not just for, the sake of learning a language. Tibetan is not a subject of hobby for Tibetans. It's a language which has one of the oldest, writing systems in the world. I think it was Nicolas Tournade, a linguist, who said that Tibetan language has one of the oldest writing systems in the world. And in this writing system, the knowledge of Buddhism, which is far more older than the CCP itself, more than 2,500 years old, is there. So they are now also trying to control the Tibetan language through not just, eliminating the language in schools, but also trying to synthesize Tibetan Buddhism by organizing workshops, by making Tibetan scholars write articles about all of this. But people will know that, the source language of Buddhism, there are many languages through which Tibetan Buddhism has, spread, and Tibetan is one of the closest. You have scholars from all around the world, exchanging languages, exchanging knowledge on Buddhism in Tibetan, in other languages. So, in the long run, the Chinese Communist Party, an atheist, ideology, is really trying to eliminate a history of one of the oldest religion in this world. And if you listen to the New Year greetings that the lineage holders of the Tibetan Buddhism in exile have shared just a few weeks ago during the New Year, you see that they are really, first of all, they start with Shijepemi, which is they express, Happy New Year greetings for Tibetans both inside and outside. It's very clear that Tibetans are not just, it's not just for the Tibetans in exile. They are always thinking in two places at the same time. That way of thinking has begun only after China colonized Tibet. Secondly, if I summarize all of those greetings that the Tibetan spiritual leaders in exile expressed, they also called for the swift, that we see the day where the just struggle of Tibet, is victorious. They also expressed that, this new year we should not, as always, not just think about oneself, but also for others, and they share the importance of the Tibetan language, how parents should introduce, their language to their children, and how His Holiness the Dalai Lama, shared that despite, these tumultuous periods under the Chinese leadership, from Cultural Revolution to the 2008 uprising to the self-immolations, but to this day, the Tibetan spirit has stayed, strong as ever. So this tradition, he says that Tibetans have until now of kind-heartedness, of warm-heartedness, is something, that even scientists say is based on reason. And, the dehumanizing, leadership that the Chinese government is trying to spread, in Tibet, in neighboring countries, or in every country that they are exporting the resources of Tibet, these countries should really think that the struggle of Tibet that has remained as ever strong until today has achieved through a leadership of a country which is in the heart of Asia, but which stays strong until today, and whose compassion we know, all of us, that is the necessity of human survival. Sorry, I was a bit long
No,
there.
that's fine. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we move on to Telo Tulku Rinpoche. And I was thinking of how, of course, we are talking not only with someone who is an expert on broadly these kinds of areas, including of geopolitics, who's inhabited different regions, but of course he is himself a reincarnate. So if you could please speak first, and then we'll have questions for you.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here, being with us today. I mean, it's so much to cover and very little time to squeeze everything within 7 to 10 minutes. But nevertheless, I just want to throw it out there and mention that I happen to be the only non-Tibetan Tibetan bureaucrat. And the reason I say that is because of my background, my ethnic background. I was born in the US to a Kalmyk immigrant family. The Kalmyk people are of Mongolian origin who have settled or been part of the Russian Empire for more than 400 years. I grew up in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in India. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I've been serving the Russian Buddhist community, in particularly where my parents and grandparents came from, which is Republic of Kalmykia, which is a Buddhist republic in the Russian Federation, assisting them to restore, rebuild, and reestablish Buddhism where it once flourished before communist Soviet Union. I've been very privileged to grow up in the Tibetan environment, to get my religious education or spiritual education, and to be a close supporter of the Tibetan movement and their struggle. The last 30 years, I've been serving, as I mentioned, in Russia. When the war broke out 2 years ago, I was the only public figure, influential person, religious figure that openly spoke out against the war and Russia's occupation of Ukraine. Therefore, I left Russia. Not only that I left Russia, in January 27th of last year, 2023, I was officially listed as a foreign agent by the Russian government. Congratulations. Thank you. So you can also say that Agent 007, but in a different way, so here we talk about Tibet, the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But sometimes I think we limit this whole issue to just Tibet and just the Dalai Lama. The reason I say that is, similarly, the Mongolian people also have their own historical, political, and religious leader, which is also called the Bokt Jibzindamba, or Khalkha Jibzindamba. Of course, no longer that Mongolia would be led by a spiritual figure, but nevertheless, he is of status the highest religious figure of Mongolia, equivalent to His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the Mongolian people. The 9th reincarnation was a Tibetan who passed away in 2013. His reincarnation has been identified, but the Mongolian people have not been able to properly enthrone him. The reason is, you may wonder, Mongolia being a democratic state, being a sovereign country, independent, but nevertheless, there are many challenges that Mongolia faces because of its southern neighbor, which is China. So China also meddles in these affairs. They bully Mongolia. They bully Mongolia by threatening to impose sanctions if the boy is identified, if the boy is enthroned, not to send him to India for his future education, and so many other issues. And of course, at the same time, India has its own interests as well. They want the boy to come to India to get its education. And to make it more interesting is the boy was born in America, which means that he's automatically an American citizen. Up until the age of 18, he is entitled to maintain 2 citizenships. At the age of 18, he will have to choose whether to have a Mongolian citizenship or an American citizenship. As we all know, that American Congress has passed a few laws on the issues of Tibet, the Tibet Policy Act. When it comes to the reincarnation, they also passed a law that the Chinese government, communist government, should not meddle in the affairs of the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So therefore, right now, what is happening before our eyes is that a testing ground. And the Mongolians are being used. And the Mongolian 10th reincarnation of the Bok Jibzin Damba is being used as a tool to see how Mongolia handles it, how India reacts to it, how America reacts, and what the Tibetans will be doing in the future. So, of course, the issue of Tibetan Buddhism, the preservation, protection, everything that is involved or related to Tibetan Buddhism is beyond Tibet's borders. And sometimes we fail to understand and recognize that. Buddhism, as we all know, was established in India. From India, it spread into Tibet. From Tibet, it came into Mongolia. And from Mongolia, our people, our ancestors, took it into Russia. And Buddhism has been part of the Russian civilization for more than 400 years. So we can think far beyond Tibet and the Himalayan region, how the importance of the preservation, protection of Buddhism is. This is not only an issue of Tibet, it's an issue of Mongolia and Russia as well. As we all know, in the 20th century, both Mongolia and the Russian Buddhists, such as the Kalmyks, Buryats, and Tuvans, and the Tibetan people have suffered a lot under communism and the communist regime. A lot has been destroyed. We can only imagine how many monasteries and monks and nuns were killed and how many institutions were destroyed, not only in Tibet, but Tibet, Mongolia, and in Russia combined. I think in the Tibetan articles that we usually publish, I think it's about 6,000 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and temples that were destroyed. That is in Tibet alone. Now let's add the number of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and monks and nuns that were killed and destroyed in Mongolia. And let's add the numbers that were destroyed in Kalmykia. When I took responsibilities as the head of the Buddhists of Kalmyk Republic, when we look at the historical archives, before communism, we had over 100 Buddhist monasteries and temples in Kalmykia. Not a single brick was left behind. All of them totally wiped out. So the preservation, the future of Tibet, is not just for the Tibetan people. It is for Mongolia and Russia as well. Though we are a minority in Russia, but Buddhism is something that has existed in the Russian civilization for over 400 years. So here I think the issue is really beyond the borders of Tibet. And it is worth for all of us to consider the impact that it can make in the future. Just before I left Mongolia a few days ago, I found out that the Chinese government has threatened Mongolia with sanctions. And the reason why? Because the 10th reincarnation of both Jibzendamba is currently not in Mongolia at the moment. I can't say where he is right now, but I do know. And the threat is, if the boy is not swiftly returned to Mongolia, we're going to sanction you. And imagine a small country that is squeezed between the two biggest threats of the world, Russia and China. Imagine where that puts Mongolia on a global stage, on an economic stage, on a political stage, and also on a spiritual stage. China has passed a law, I can't remember what exact year it was, where it clearly states that in the future, any reincarnation has to be approved by the Chinese government. Seriously? You think the Mongolians are going to listen to that? You think my future reincarnation will accept that? I don't think so. And future reincarnations that we need to get approval from the Chinese government? Let's say there's a boy that was born in the UK, a very high, well-respected reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhism. And the China demands that this boy needs to get approval from the CCP. Do you think that is something that the UK government is going to allow and accept? Just because they passed a law to control all future Buddhist or religious figures of Tibetan Buddhism. And when we say Tibetan Buddhism, it's not just the Tibetans. It's the whole Himalayan belt, which is mainly part of India. That includes Nepal, a sovereign state. That also includes Bhutan, which is an independent nation. And far beyond into Mongolia and Russia, as I mentioned. So here it may seem like that I'm speaking more about the Mongolian side and the Russian side, but I'm mentioning all this because Tibetan Buddhism is much more beyond its borders. And I think it is worthy for all of us to have a united voice and to learn more about the impact and the importance, not only about Tibet, but also in other countries that is also relevant and much more important as well. So I think I've said enough, yeah? I mean, I could go on, but, but then again, I sincerely apologize in advance if I've spoken too much, but...
You haven't.
Yes.
You're 1,000-year-old, so you're reincarnation of Telopa, who was a saint in 9th or 10th century, so you have got right to take more time, but thank you so much for this. Now, yeah. So before I come to a couple of questions to facilitate discussion, I did want to highlight some of the things you issued. So in 2002, His Holiness the Dalai Lama visited Mongolia, and trains were stopped. The Trans-Mongolian Railway was stopped by China for 2 days. That led to a spike in copper prices in the world. Now, of course, China said there are technical problems, but almost everyone knew that the reason was to punish Mongolia and the wider world, that this is what China can do. And this is 2002. And 2002 is a period where people barely or hardly spoke about China as a rising power. So imagine if what happened in 2002, that was a message to the wider world and to Mongolia, what can be done. In 2013, when we met for the first time in Ulaanbaatar, it was an International Association for Tibetan Studies conference. This takes place every 3 years. We were part of that. And I recall that there was always a concern amongst academics and organization of the conference that we have to not be political. We should not say anything that will upset China, because if we do, then Tibetans from Tibet will not be allowed to come. And I recall that that conference, also seminar, there was a whole concern about how many Tibetans will be allowed to come out of Tibet and out of China to visit the seminar. Till 3 or 4 days before the seminar, the expectation was, let's say, 50 or whatever. The numbers were barely 5. So what would happen is, and China used it quite effectively, to give a sense that if you temper yourself down, if you tone yourself down, if you're not political, if you're not doing X, Y, Z, we may allow some things, except that even when you accept Chinese terms or Chinese government terms, people will still not be allowed. So I remember that also vis-a-vis Mongolia, that was there. And this is, I mean, you got a snapshot of the ways in which, of course, this is very much about geopolitics. It's not only about belief system. It's not only about believing in reincarnation. For Chinese government, it's quite clear. So it's 2007 when then they passed Order Number 5. Again, I have worked on this, and Order Number 5 makes it quite clear that any reincarnation inside China has to have permission of Chinese Buddhist Association. So they don't say Chinese government. So on paper, you think it's fine. It's a Buddhist association, a religious organization that is going to approve. Other than the Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama, and few other seniors, it would be done by Chinese Buddhist Association. Now, anyone who'd studied the Chinese Buddhist Association would know that it is closely connected to and controlled 100% by United Front Work Department. A United Front Work Department is Communist Party wing. So clearly, the idea that somehow it's a religious organization that's responsible for approving reincarnation, making an application, does not work, because that religious organization is completely under the control of Communist Party of China. So as you pointed out, we are dealing with an odd situation where a party that does not believe in God, that does not believe in sacred, that does not believe in any religion, that is officially atheist, claims the authority over matters of reincarnation, right? That's what we are dealing with. Now, given that's what we have talked about, if I could ask each one, maybe starting with you to reflect on, so we know how it's significant not only for Tibetans, but beyond Tibetans. But what can, and I'll start with you, Rinpoche, what can outsiders do to prevent absolute control over these affairs by Communist Party of China? What are the things we can do and others can do?
I think it really depends on our backgrounds. There's journalists, there's academians, there's historians, and there's the general public. I think awareness is very important. I think we need to further study beyond Tibet and its impact on a global scale. And I think it not necessarily should be strictly historical, but also we have to look at the political aspect and the economical aspect as well. I think it's very important for, in particularly the academic, community to further study a little bit more, because it seems like, from my understanding, it's, most of the Tibet specialists and those who've been emphasizing their research and their studies, on Tibet, it's just simply of what's going on in Tibet. I mean, as I pointed out right now, what's happening in Mongolia right now, that also impacts the future reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhism. Since Mongolia became a democratic state back in the early 90s, after being a communist government for, over 70 years, and we had that opportunity to reconnect our historical ties with the Tibetan people. Unfortunately, we restored that ties, but it happened in exile. Before communism was introduced into Mongolia and Tibet, thousands of pilgrimage, monks went to Tibet to obtain their studies. And when Mongolia had the opportunity of open society, free travel, restoration of their faith, culture, they went to India. And to this day, there's hundreds of Mongolians who are studying in various institutions that have been reestablished under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This shows how much we are dependent on the continuation of the Buddhist, what we call lineage, and Buddhist culture and identity and the teachings. So we are very much dependent on the Tibetans, even though we are a democratic state. And we will always be dependent on the Tibetans. And what can the Tibetans learn from Mongolia? If Tibet was to become an independent nation today, it's not going to be easy, of course. There will be many challenges. And at that time, this is where Mongolia can be an example, because there's so many similarities mentally, culturally, lifestyle, and so on. To this day, there is, the Mongolian population is very small, of course. It's 3 million. Half of the population are still living a nomadic life. And due to the global change, climate change and things like that, Mongolia's lifestyle is also changing as well. Just this morning, I woke up and, I'm just going through social media, just checking up on what was happening. Just over the weekend, there was a winter storm in Mongolia, and livestock is at stake. The nomads are at stake. There's like a few meters high snow that even some of their yurts or geras, their tents, are under snow. So the global climate change, how it is impacting Mongolia today, be in front of our eyes, can also be an impact in Tibet as well. And we know very, we know very clear that, China has been imposing, and forcing many of the nomads into what they call housing, communal housing. And that itself is destroying the nomadic lifestyle of the Tibetan people. And of course, global climate change, of course, it will definitely have an impact on Tibet in the future. So I think there's really a lot that really Tibet, Mongolia can really share and learn and work together in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tenzin, if I could go to you next, and if you'd also cover what can the world broadly do, and you don't need to cover everything, but a couple of things, but also maybe refer to the environmental challenges, because I know you have also worked on that. So,
what can the world broadly do? The first thing I think that comes to my mind is the recent Universal Periodic Review. That was a very clear window into where all the countries stand, in relation to Tibet. And it was really clear that, the global South had effectively been, very much now under the, control of China through its trade and, relations and Belt and Road Initiative. I think the first thing the outside world needs to do is really recognize the importance of Tibetan Buddhism. As Rinpoche just highlighted how, from how Tibetan Buddhism and beyond, it's not just about Tibet, it's deeply, interrelated with the culture and language and the monasteries, the lineages, the initiations, and even the title itself, Dalai Lama, which was offered by the Altai Khan to the third, His Holiness Dalai Lama. So to see that this ancient religion, which is from India, the land of the learned ones, as we say in Tibetan, but in this 21st century, it has it has really benefited, people beyond Tibet and its neighboring countries. When I speak to the officers who have worked with Tibetan refugees in France, they say that they really do see a difference in the Tibetan refugees who are there, that they seem to really mobilize themselves together, even if they are out, in camps, under the tents, they put up a photo of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and then they organize themselves, and they really appreciate that, people who are so vulnerable, but they still seem to have something really at the center. So I'll not get into more of that, but to really recognize the importance of Tibetan Buddhism, for Tibet and its neighbor countries and beyond. The second one is in the event of, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's passing, which the Chinese government is really awaiting, what I think is that they will look for opportunities where there will be difference in opinions, and they will try to really, make it worse, fuel it, how to, create divisions between the different opinions, how to amplify that on social media, and how amid all of that, the Tibetan perspectives will be drowned. The third thing I think they might do is that, in that situation, they might bring in old arguments that might have divided Tibetans, old arguments that might have divided even, in the history, old arguments that might have divided, the spiritual leaders even. So they really need to, media especially, I think that they should be well ahead prepared that in such an event, they should not just lose sight of what matters the most in that situation. A Tibetan from Tibet told me recently that the Karmapa, obviously the Chinese government is not allowing any photos of His Holiness Dalai Lama, anything related to him, but he told me an incident of how they're allowing, heated, arguments in WeChat groups about the Karmapa. And even other spiritual leaders were trying so hard to, explain to the people in voice messages, this is not correct, that it's really disturbing the whole society, So they know, where to create divisions, media especially. And amid all of that, there will be Tibet where nobody will, until today, has no access to. The media outside will have access to the exile and diaspora community. So, traditionally, the Tibetan exile and diaspora community and the freedom movement have not been clearly understood by the media. If you look at the Tibet support groups, their information is based on incidents coming from inside Tibet. It's based on truth. It's based on, so it's not like these Tibetan exiles are just shouting in front of the Chinese embassy for no reason. So, I think there's a huge role that the media has to play here in really deeply listening to where these, Tibetan exile and diaspora communities are coming from. There are different hues of experience of Tibetans in exile. They are the ones who are born in Tibet but who lived all their lives in exile. They are the ones who were born in exile but then who have, dreamed all their lives of returning to Tibet. And then there are those who have no parents, but then their friends in schools and, the teachers have been their family and, guiding, light for all their lives. So to appreciate and really, listen to Tibetans, to, go and speak to the Tibetan government in exile, and not just, get trapped into these, divisive topics that the Chinese government will be trying to fuel intentionally through all mediums. I think that's, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. Kate, a specific one for you is about what can foreign governments ideally do to, again, prevent this? Maybe they can't change things, but also slow down, stop, or challenge the Chinese government's approach, which is that they want to control 100% the politics of reincarnation.
Absolutely. Just to follow up on that point, and I will answer that question, but last year in March in Dharamsala, the Dalai Lama conferred an important religious teaching, which was connected to the Mongolian Jetsun Dampa lineage. And the small child, recognized now as the 10th Jetsun Dampa, was there at the Dalai Lama's feet. And that was the first sort of formal recognition and appearance of the child after years of keeping it secret, and also years of China trying to prevent that happening. So I think it's also important to look at the fact that because that did happen, the Dalai Lama had outmaneuvered China in their struggle to prevent any sort of recognition outside China, because for China it's a territorial issue. Just as the Dalai Lama takes the position that while Tibet and China are in the situation they're in, it makes no sense for him to reincarnate inside the PRC. So China is trying to enforce territorial restrictions and to say that the Dalai Lama can't be reincarnated outside the PRC. So I wanted to mention that because the Dalai Lama's power and influence, as we've discussed, transcends borders, and it affects all of these different territories, many Buddhist countries, not only India, Nepal, also Mongolia. And I spoke about this issue last year on a panel with the US State Department Special Coordinator, Azra Zaya. And she had a nice phrase for the global response that was needed. She said that she thought that we should aim to be force multipliers for the Tibetan people and for the Tibetan Buddhist civilization, and to not only acknowledge and to really affirm that Tibet's significance is strategic. It matters across the world. And because it does, my primary recommendation to foreign governments is that there must be a greater preparedness, not only among Western countries, but also among other Buddhist countries, among neighboring countries, particularly in India, where China's main efforts are targeted, but to really counter and challenge China's extraterritorial intrusions and to protect Tibetan agency going into the future. So that can take the form of governments adopting language, taking a position that supports the authority of the Dalai Lama. When the Dalai Lama made a statement about his own reincarnation in 2011, that was his first formal statement, at which he decided that when he is about 90, he will gather significant religious leaders around him and other people around him, and he will make a statement or make a decision or communicate, and that is in 2025, so this period is imminent. But I think it took probably more than a decade for governments to really support that statement in the form of the US Tibet Policy and Support Act, which not only recognized the Dalai Lama's authority over his own reincarnation and the right of Tibetan Buddhists to choose their own leaders, but it also said that it would impose sanctions on anybody who is seeking to interfere with the reincarnation. So international governments, we don't have legislation in the UK or in the EU, but we are asking governments to at least take a position and adopt language, and that will help to protect them in future when China knocks on their door, demanding that they endorse their candidate, Chinese Panchen Lama, which will inevitably happen, demanding that they take steps to endorse a future imposter candidate, Dalai Lama. So the position in language is one thing. And then also, I think, very, very important for Western governments who have received the Dalai Lama across the world to great acclaim in football stadiums, attracting thousands of people in Britain, in America. He's a very popular leader globally. But also for governments to deal multilaterally with partners, particularly including India, Mongolia, Nepal, Bhutan. India is particularly important because that's where the Dalai Lama is based, and that's where the exile administration is based. And so there will be efforts by China to shut down institutions, to prevent China has already succeeded to an extent in preventing Tibetan refugees escaping across the border into Nepal. So the agency of Tibetans in future must be protected. It also means governments like Britain, like the EU, like America, increasing their multilateral communications with countries like Mongolia in order to support them against these very powerful neighbors.
Thank you. So we have covered various grounds. We have talked about, going back to Mongolia, I was reminded of a region, of course, that has been largely vanquished. That's Inner Mongolia, right? And this is, in a way, one could look at the ways in which Chinese state has managed to colonize and almost crush dissent and even distort culture. And Inner Mongolia is an example. That's what they're aiming for vis-a-vis Uyghurs, vis-a-vis Tibetans, vis-a-vis Hong Kong, and that's what they will aim for even in the neighboring countries. So we have to start with thinking that they have a successful model, not successful in good sense, but successful from a colonizer's perspective. That's number one. I was also thinking in terms of when you talked of media and ignorance, Tenzin, recently, I was going through a particular case of asylum request by a Tibetan being rejected, and I was going through, because I was an expert, it came to me, I was going through the questions asked from the tribunal people, right, whoever they are, the officers, and they kept asking that, why do you think that if you're protesting on Tibet, Chinese government will know? And it was not a single, they kept asking same kind of stupid question, which anyone, if they're bothered to read foreign office documents or UK government policies, should know that, of course, the surveillance, the transnational repression is so high, but there's almost an ignorance at other levels where unless you're involved with Tibet or Uyghurs or Hong Kong, or maybe even with China to an extent, you'd have no clue what's happening. So this is part of, I would suggest, and I've been here for 25 years in this country, Chinese government has been quite successful in reducing the footprint and the impact that, let's say, if you look at Tibetan movement, has had on the popular consciousness. So that's changing, they're working towards that. And you're right, divide and rule, that's how colonizers function, that's what they do. Shugden issue is one of them. Again, if anyone pays attention to which lamas get to go to Tibet, which lamas come to the West, again, I have given talks on this. There was a complaint against me that I was disrespecting a particular religion, which is Shugden worship, right? I wasn't, but I was accused of that. Giving example that at every stage, you know the Chinese government, well, you would know in any case, but maybe for those who don't know much and is being recorded, the Chinese government is very closely watching and interfering wherever they can, right? At every stage. You pointed out, Kate, in terms of the role of course, agency of Tibetans, and that is something that all people outside should be focused on, and that includes the role of India. We don't have time, maybe during question answer it will come up. Role of India comes up again and again, because that is more than land of Buddha, etc. Because of course, most Indians don't know this land of Buddha. That's also a challenge with Buddhism. That essentially the rejuvenation of India as homeland of Buddhism comes via Tibetans. That's the reality since 1950s. So when we look at that, we know that there's a lot more work needs to be done there. So again, we have covered a lot. Do you want to make a comment and then we'll open up? Yeah, please.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something which I think is very important, and I think the international community, which is not very much aware of. Shugila had mentioned earlier that there was a media scandal, I don't know if that's the right term, about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. What's the right term here? Kissing an Indian boy publicly, right? Which was really not the case, right? If we look at the month that the event took place, which happened to be in February, and the timing that came out as a scandal, which was in May. Why did it take from February till May for all of that to come out? Right? And here, Kate has mentioned last March, the reincarnation of the Mongolian spiritual leader, the 10th Bokt, was in Dharamsala. And His Holiness Dalai Lama just simply made a statement by saying, the reincarnation of Bokt Jubsdamba is here. We're very happy that he's here. and to continue this lineage to be passed on. That was it. Less than 10 seconds that His Holiness mentioned about the boat. That was the only time that he was publicly, what's the right word? Installed, announced, recognized, identified. Till then, the Mongolians had never officially identified or enthroned or identified him publicly. So that happened in March. Then whole hell broke loose. Excuse my language, but that's what happened. The Chinese start calling the Mongolian government. The Indians start saying, who is this boy? What happened? Where does he come from? How did he end up in India? So many things happened. Then when the boy returned back to Mongolia, China came in and said, don't you dare send this boy to India. He must be educated in Mongolia. Why do you think that is? There's many reasons for that. So what happened was, so the Chinese were masterminding this scandal against His Holiness the Dalai Lama in May. In June of that year, what happened was a Mongolian mother said, my son, who's at the Mongolian monastery, was sexually molested. Made a huge scandal. The whole monastery was shut down. Investigators came in. A lot of research was being done. The monastery itself was being investigated. The mother was being investigated. I think he was 11 years old. He was being questioned. And the boy was forced to say, by we know who, by his mother, and the mother was forced to, or bribed, whatever way, to say that a monk who studied in India told me, you're going to go to India soon, therefore, you need to know these kind of activities. We're making it normal for you so that when you go to India, in a monastic institution, it's normal. You see, can you connect the dots, right? The whole idea was for the Mongolian public to raise an issue and say, we should not send our reincarnation to India because this is what happens in India. This is all mastermind, and we do have sufficient proof and facts that this was all planned out. This whole thing was not just against His Holiness the Dalai Lama alone. This was also to prevent the Mongolian reincarnation of going to India to a Tibetan institution to obtain his further studies. Why is China so scared of this little boy going to India? Well, if he grows up in India, just like me, grows up, being a Mongolian of origin, growing up in a Tibetan community, knowing the facts, later on at an adult age, and most likely when he finishes education, the 14th Dalai Lama will no longer be with us. So the issue of Tibet, the issue of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, doesn't die. The boy will be inspired by the Tibetans, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, come back to Mongolia and continue to say, my spiritual guru, my spiritual leader, my spiritual mentor, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I'm grateful to the Tibetan people for giving me this opportunity to study in a Buddhist monastery. The Tibet issue doesn't die off. So that's the only reason why China doesn't want this little boy to go to India to obtain his studies. And for them to threaten a nation over a little boy, whether he goes to school or goes to a monastery, it may seem like a small issue, but we talk about geopolitics, right? This is all about it. This is all it is. Just wanted to make that,
Yeah,
add that on.
thank you so much. Now we have time around 10 minutes, but we'll make it 15 minutes for question answer. So if people have question, and Shambhavi or Rajat, could you help with the microphone? So we'll take 3 or 4 questions together, keep it brief, and then I'll ask, not all of you have to respond because we don't have time. 1 round, 2 rounds, and then we'll have vote of thanks. Yeah? Okay, so 1, 2, who else is there? Raise your hand so that we know. Okay, we know the 2 people. Okay, please.
We all know how evil the Chinese Communist Party is. And thank God that there are people like you guys who have strong voices to speak out and keep the flames of Tibet burning. My question is, for us on the floor, what are your thoughts on how best we can serve and help the cause of Tibet, Tibetans, and Tibetan Buddhism?
Thank you. Doctor, yeah.
I have 2 questions. First question is His Holiness always mentioned that I will stay longer, like 10, 20 years more. And my first question is, who has the ownership of Dalai Lama's reincarnation?
Sorry?
And
who has the ownership?
Who have ownership of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation? What is the role of the Ganden Pota and the Tibetan government exile in the regarding of the complexities of the China, United States, India, Tibet, and all these things, right? There are so many geopolitics. And my second question is, Rinpoche talk about the Jizun Tamba, right? And what we can learn from what is happening now in Mongolia.
So what can we learn from Mongolia and what's happening there, and in terms of who has the ownership of the process within government in exile and in Dharamshala? That's the 2 questions from you. One is about what can we do as public. That's number 2. Anyone else who has a question? No? Okay, please.
Well, I think the first one, first question.
Okay.
Public
I'll just say something very quickly, which is about, and probably Choekyi should comment on this as a Tibetan, but I would just say that China is trying to erase Tibet. And its techniques, strategies of cognitive warfare in Tibet itself, literally seeking to change minds and alter beliefs, do meet the NATO definition of cognitive warfare. On the Tibetan side, of course, they have cognitive resilience to an extent, and they're developing very skillful ways to protect and preserve their culture. So given that China is trying to erase the Tibetan people, to impose its own language, it's very, very important that we don't. So that's a very small and simple thing, and that we continue to talk about it, and that we continue to talk about the integrity of the Tibetan Buddhist culture. But do you want to say something about what people can do?
What can people do? People keep continuing using Tibet, and whenever they hear anyone say Shizang, clarify to them that that's not Tibetan word to start with, and that is that it's Tibet, and that reminding people that there is a Tibetan government in exile, that Tibet was an independent nation, and that there are Tibetan exile and diaspora communities across the world are keeping this issue alive, based on the fact that Tibetans inside Tibet, knowing that there are no journalists with cameras, coming to them to take photos of evidence, they still continue to protest right in front of the county police station, or even share information of the mining protests, of everything really, basically the truth. So supporting the Tibetan exile and diaspora communities and the support groups. I think the challenge we are seeing is that, His Holiness the Dalai Lama became very well known, especially after the Nobel Peace Prize, 1989, and then, the Tibet freedom movement was internationalized. But then we are seeing there's a change in generation of the Tibetan supporters. His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself, actually, I remember seeing one of the videos where he is, walking on the stage, and then he looks at the audience, and then, he recognizes everyone has aged along with him. So I think it's quite, it's inevitable. But then, but we are, there are young Tibetans everywhere, really, making, making podcasts, discussing, issues with each other, discussing things that are happening inside Tibet. They are, trying to find information. They're trying to stay connected, and if the Tibetan movement became to be known through the Hollywood actors in the 90s, over time, there has also been, all the communities, all the peoples oppressed under the Chinese Communist parties have all come together. Tibetans, Uyghurs, the Mongolians, Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, It's only in the past few years that on 1st October, Chinese Communist Party's Day, you see all of us, young people gathered together in front of the Chinese embassy protesting. So I think this speaks to itself. It's not just in London, but everywhere that Tibetans are, it has, stayed ever more alive and even more united. So I think reminding people that might encourage, everybody who care about truth and justice to, come join the Tibetan freedom movement.
Yeah, I think, from my observation, activism is on a decline, volunteerism is on a decline, philanthropy is on a decline, and when it comes to the issue of Tibet, support is on a decline as well. It's unfortunate, but I think we should never give up. I think every email, phone call, or even a postcard, sharing your concern, voice, it may seem like a drop in the ocean, but, if we continue to drop and drop and drop, it will definitely make a difference. And I think, there's many ways of doing that. And, one of the ways of what Tibet Watch is doing, they're doing wonderful, tremendous work, There's many ways to help. When I say support, it doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of monetary support. There's many ways of sharing their information, spreading their awareness, and I think that's something that we should not give up on, So I think that's one of the ways to, keep our spirit alive, is not to give up and be, consistent and move forward and keep doing it until, we're no longer on this planet, if I may say that. Second question. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has made it very clear back in the day, for whether the institution of the Dalai Lama to exist or not, it's up to the Tibetan people. Now, the Tibetan people, what are they saying? It's up to the Dalai Lama. So it kind of goes back and forth a little bit, right? His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I think the reason why he said it's up to the Tibetan people is for the Tibetan to start thinking, okay, this is what the Dalai Lama is saying. What would I do, or what should we do, or how can we do things? The Tibetans, tend to be a little bit lazy, I'm sorry to say. Well, it's up to him. Whether he reincarnates or not, he'll make a decision, right? Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the conference or the gathering that His Holiness held in 2011 when, he was starting to discuss about the future existence of the institution of the Dalai Lama. Due to time shortage, I couldn't get my visa on time. I couldn't make it to India, but nevertheless, I watched the recordings. During that time, when we looked at it, His Holiness asked other people's opinions. Other people meaning other religious leaders, their opinion. Majority of them kept silent. They didn't really say anything that was in that particular nature. So that's why His Holiness said, okay, I'm still young, I'll say something when I'm about 90. 1 more year left, a year and a half left before he turns 90. Is the Tibetan people prepared? Left or right or middle or any direction? I'm sorry to say, nobody's ready. We're all waiting for a statement. And only then we will react. And here, every time, lately His Holiness the Dalai Lama frequently mentions, I'm going to live until 110, 113. Everybody claps their hand like, oh, wow, yeah, he's going to be with us for another, 20-something years. I'm sorry to say, as a representative, I've had many dealings with His Holiness and His Holiness's office. I'm sorry to say, he may live that long, but it doesn't mean that he's going to continue to give teachings, give public audiences, and be visible. There will be a day that we will no longer see him. We will just simply say that, oh, His Holiness is alive. That's it. As a representative, I've had meetings, discussions, consultations, led delegations, sat down and talked for hours, had tea. The last time I had such a meeting was before the pandemic. And my longest, since the pandemic, my longest engagement with His Holiness, 2 minutes maximum, tops. And I'm supposed to be the representative. So that shows, that's the reality of it right now, right? If I say this in a public Tibetan audience, I probably would get stoned right now. Like, how dare you say that, How dare you even think like that? But that's the reality, and we have to be prepared for that, right? So, His Holiness is aging. We all know that, yes. And right now, there's already preparations to celebrate His Holiness' 90th birthday on a global scale. What is the purpose of that? Does that mean that by celebrating, he's going to give more teachings, he's going to become energized and young and, give more public audiences? Absolutely not. And I think it is worth for us to be concentrating and, thinking and planning how to challenge China with this particular issue. China already has their hands in this. They're already planning. And they're using the Mongolian reincarnation as a testing ground. Many Tibetans don't even know that. Why? Because we're too focused on simply Tibet itself. Sometimes we fail to think beyond that. Our culture, our heritage, our religion is beyond Tibet and the impact that it has on other nations, other sovereign nations. Not minorities like the Himalayan region, Ladakis, Membas, and Denjongs. On nations. Bhutan may be small, but it's a nation. Mongolia might be squeezed between Russia and China, but it's a big nation. And now we're talking about Russia, Putin. So, right now, the biggest, recently I was in a International Religious Freedom Conference, or Believers Conference, they call it, that took place in Prague. Every presentation that I listened to was anti-China, anti-Russia. Anti-China, anti-Russia. It's a big threat. And just imagine, Tibetan Buddhism being squeezed between those two nations. Not only Tibet, but also Mongolia as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So what we have is, I was thinking in 2021, there was a resolution in the parliament, a motion in the parliament about declaring the genocide of Uyghurs. Remember? Of course, the UK government didn't follow up and they did not declare it, but at least there was a motion. So one thing which the public can do widely, of course, and we can do is, again, lobby the MPs, and remember, election is coming, hopefully soon, not too late, but lobby the people who are going to stand in the election, because they might promise things now which they may not fulfill later. That's okay. But at least let them promise, and wherever you are, whichever constituency you are part of, get 2 or 3, politicians, whichever side they are part, to in a way commit to discussing a motion when they get elected or not elected, whatever, getting it in the parliament, something where it is simply about that the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama is a Tibetan affair and not anyone else's affair. They may not even use the word China. Fine, they're scared of China, they should not use the word China. But at least they can say that the reincarnation is something that Tibetans should decide for themselves. That is something we can lobby for and work toward. That's a practical thing. What Rinpoche pointed out, of course, is also the over-dependence, perceived over-dependence of Tibetans in exile and Tibetan cause on one single person, in this case the Dalai Lama. And we saw that even when he resigned and gave up the political leadership, the first reaction was, no, he should still be considered as a leader. He gave up on the national leadership part, still the focus was he is the leader. So there has been constant effort by the Dalai Lama to, let's say, devolve and give up on power, but Tibetans to go back and looking for answers via him. So what you're pointing out, of course, is if we want to be prepared for this, what we need is less dependence on one person, one figure, though he is a very crucial figure, and taking responsibility by all Tibetans in exile. I mean, not talking exile because we're not talking inside, taking everyone else taking responsibility if they care about human rights and they care about self-determination in that region. On that note, we have no time for further questions, but can I please invite Joe Hipgrave from the Chair of Trustees at Tibet Watch, please. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Tibet Watch and Free Tibet, I'd like to thank Telo Tulku Rinpoche for taking time to come here today and giving us the benefit of his insight and wisdom. Thank you very much, Rinpoche.
Thank you.
Also, Kate Saunders and Tenzin Choekyi for their contributions this evening. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating talk, and we really appreciate your joining us. And I'd like to thank Professor Nitasha Kaul and Professor Dibyesh Anand for hosting this evening, making this evening possible, and putting the panel together. And additionally, thank you, Dibyesh, for chairing this evening. I think I'd just like to say a couple of things about Tibet Watch and the work that's been going on. I'd like to draw your attention to this report, Weaponizing Big Data. This report has recently come out, produced by Kate and Tenzin Choekyi here. That's come out. It's already been causing it's already had quite a bit of impact. It's been put in front of MPs. It's found its way to the FCDO. It's had good media coverage, including a detailed report on the BBC about it. And I think this is the key, really, to what we're doing. And people have been asking this evening what we should be doing to make a difference. And this really is the key to it, and this is what Tibet Watch does. Finding out this information, producing reports, and making sure that that information gets to the key people. It's absolutely crucial that the people who are deciding policy, internationally and at a government level, should have this information. And this is information that, of course, Beijing doesn't really want to be thrown around, but that's our job, is to do that. And that's the key thing. And I think, what did you say, Kate, was the phrase force multipliers? Yes. Yes. And you said, Rinpoche, yourself, that support is on the decline. And I think that's the key there, really, is that I think what we'd like everybody to do today is to become a force multiplier. Pick up this report on your way out. There are copies by the door. And read it and share it with friends. Go online on tibetwatch.org and take a look there. There are lots of reports there on what's going on, human rights, reports about religion freedom, and of course about the environmental situation in Tibet, which is extremely worrying. Look at those reports and share them with friends. And sign up. Please sign up to get regular updates from us. Keep in touch and tell your friends as well. So I think we've got an excellent team at Tibet Watch and Free Tibet who are doing this work, and they're doing it brilliantly. And the concern at the moment is, as Rinpoche said, that support is on the decline. And we are trying to find a way to reverse that, and we will. And the team sitting at the desk at the back there have been working away on this and will continue to do so. But maybe tonight we can start reversing that decline if you could all just go on the website and sign up. Additionally, you said, Rinpoche, it's not all about philanthropy. Unfortunately, a large part of it is. On the back of this report, there is a donation form. Please, if you don't give already, fill in the form. There's an envelope there, and support us. Ideally, you could become regular donors and help us to continue this work, and just to make sure that this information continues to find its way in front of the policymakers all over the world, and that's how we'll make a difference. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and can we just say thank you again to our excellent panel this evening.
Thank you, Joe. And can I finally invite Professor Nitasha Kaul back again for a vote of thanks from University of Westminster, please.
I don't want to keep you from your, from the refreshments too long, and I will get to the vote of thanks. But I just want to emphasize first that it has been a great pleasure to have this conversation, to have our guests, and I want to just leave you with a few thoughts, because this is something that many of us have engaged with over a long, very long period of time. Yeah. So I want you to reflect. I mean, as an educator, many of you are already involved with causes, but I want you to think seriously about what are the ways in which we can make these kinds of connections. I think the very important connections beyond the silos that we might be thinking about rights and justice in. I mean, the religion politics accommodation has been truly difficult in modernity, right? And different countries have tried different ways around it, but it's not going anywhere. It's not specific to any religion, but people are not going to just simply give up religious identity, right? So this is one thing to think about. The other thing is that when we think about these parts of the world that we've been talking about, and I've worked on various bits of the Himalayas, specifically on Bhutan, Kashmir, but also other places, it is really important to see how the arriving at sovereignty has been almost a roulette kind of exercise. There have been regimes. There is nothing that you can conclusively say that makes one place have achieved sovereignty and another not. But I think equally that is not just a cause for despair. That also gives us hope, because what that means is that things that may seem impermanent may in fact be impermanent. So we cannot in fact give up the idea that people can have greater rights, can have greater freedoms. And part of that reimagining, I think, as you as the Rinpoche pointed out, is that we have to think beyond the one set. And that means thinking about what is the learning of repertoires of repression across contexts, right? What do majoritarian nationalisms of big, supposedly non-imperial, but fairly imperial acting nations, what do they learn from each other in how they suppress religion, whichever religion that is? Or how is oppression learned across different contexts? So, when I think about it, if you think about the fact that, of course, India and China have different regime types, and of course, geopolitics is mostly strategic hypocrisy, but it's very important to also question, well, is it actually even strategic? Or is it just hypocrisy that keeps increasing the risks for us in the long run, and we're not getting anywhere? It's always called strategic, but what's strategic about prolonging people's ill-being for long periods of time, and it doesn't help anyone. And I think that is the argument that we can make in places where we are safe, where we don't have to worry about being carted off to prison, if we make these arguments. And I think that's really important for us to talk about. Why is it not possible to depict places accurately on maps? Yeah? And I mean rising powers context especially. Why is it that, that people in places like, why isn't that, I've written about, for instance, Kashmir and Xinjiang sharing a border. Why is it that we don't see how technologies of repression move across borders? Why isn't it that we see places like people's movements in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in the Uyghur people, in Tibet, Tibetans outside of Tibet? Injustices, this is not reinvention of the wheel, this is Martin Luther King Jr., injustices are connected. It's very important for us to think carefully. And thinking is a verb, it's an activity. It doesn't happen unless we do it. And that thinking feeds into action and vice versa. So I just want to leave you with, with also maybe thinking about ways of making this argument in different ways. There is so much focus on, excuse me, on sustainable development. Our university is a champion of the pursuit of SDGs. What does SDG 17 tell us? What do the SDGs on peace, justice, partnership, institutions? Maybe there are newer ways in which we can make these arguments for why institutions are important, peace is important, justice is important. And lastly, I could go on because this is, part of life's work, but I want to make one small caveat about Bhutan. Bhutan is a country that I know intimately for the last, best part of 3 decades. A small sovereign country that shares some of these dilemmas. And small states, which is a focus of my work, have to go through the worst often in the international system. When these are the places where you can be most innovative, which are actually trying to do things differently, not relying on military power, and yet these are the places that get the worst in the international system. And therefore, as I argue, we must subalternize geopolitics. Please let us not, as whatever we do in our lives, let us not take the standard geopolitical script as rational for granted, because most often it is not. It is neither rational nor strategic. It's hypocritical when we want to hold our rivals to account, because they don't share the values that we think make sense. Please let us also hold our friends to account, and when they fail, let us ask everyone to do better. And the very last thing, I think, before the vote of thanks, I want to say it is also very vital. This is, as an institution, as an educational institution, as an educator, I have to say this. Places are not the same as people. States are not the same as people, right? So when we talk about when we talk about a Chinese position, we are obviously referring to the state. We are not referring to people, many of whom struggle against their own states in order to further these values. So I think we must keep that in mind because thinking and doing are interrelated. Now, lastly, I want to again thank you all for being here. We do events here all the time. As I said, I work on Bhutan. Just next Tuesday, we will have an event on sustainability, tourism in Bhutan. It's important not to ventriloquize small states, but to hear from people. So we'll have, a Bhutanese person and others speak. So we have events, CSD, on the webpage. You can see, further events and other initiatives that we have. Let us continue to be part of a community, engage with each other. Thank you again for our great panelists. Thank you, Joe. Tibet Watch does amazing work. Please do support them. And most importantly, the people without whom none of this would be possible, Rajat, Shambhavi, who are there at the back, Leon and Theo, who are doing the recording, and the most important person, without whom none of this would be possible, Tenzin Kunga. Tenzin Kunga is incredible. He's a star. Tenzin's our master's student. He also, he has done amazing things, and it just shows you how much anyone can do, but Tenzin does more than most people most of the time. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And finally, please join us for reception. The noise that you are hearing is, of course, to do with catering. So please join us. I don't know how much food there is, but there should be plenty of wine, if not plenty of food. So please join us, and thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
All of yours, but I think your perspective.
Thank you. You should visit, yeah.